It's a real pleasure to be here, really an honor to be chosen for this. What I'm going to try to do today is give you a sense of sort of some of the things we've learned as a field, also from my lab, about what happens when we sleep with respect to memory. I would be very happy to take questions as we go. I might have to turn them off if we start running out of time, but I'm always more in favor of interactive talks than just one-way talks. So please feel free to raise your hand, or if you really know what you're doing, you can press the microphone button in the back of the seat in front of you and get it to work, but that's a little bit more tentative sometimes. Okay, so let me go ahead and get started. So a few initial thoughts on sleep. For those of you who are not deeply familiar with sleep, I would encourage you to watch Yang Dan's lecture. I know you're familiar with it personally, but scientifically speaking, she was recorded here in the spring, and she has a really nice introduction to sleep and sleep stages and things like that. And because she has all of that online, I'm going to skip most of that and really just focus in on sort of memory and what sleep has to do with that. So, as you probably all know, sleep is critical for survival across species. All animals seem to sleep. It has many functions, and we're still sorting out what lots of those are. But one of them seems to be related to learning and memory. So sleeping does things to your brain. Your brain is active when you sleep in interesting ways that seem to have to do with processing information related to what experiences you had. But one thing I want to emphasize today is just how much we don't understand. So one of the reasons I ended up in neuroscience as opposed to some other field is just the yawning chasms of ignorance that we have about so many fundamental things about how we work and how our brains work. And so we've made a lot of progress understanding sleep and memory, but oh my goodness, is there a lot we don't know, and I'll try and highlight that as we go through. Okay, so let me tell you a few things that we know about sleep and memory. These are from human studies, and I wanted to present these just to give people a little bit of sort of context for this. So here's one nice study from the early 2000s, very simple. It just asks, what does sleep deprivation do to memory? I think you probably all know the answer to this. It's slightly more subtle, though, than you think. So what they did is they gave subjects a really simple task. They just gave them 10 positive words, 10 negative words, and 10 neutral words, and sort of presented those to people. Then 36 hours later, they gave them a list of new positive, negative, and neutral words, and they had to indicate whether they were old or new. And then one group of people was kept awake for those 36 hours, and one group wasn't. Okay, so pretty obvious what's going to happen here. The people who were kept awake didn't remember so well, right? So that's the red bar here, not a surprise at all. But what was kind of fun is that it was a little different for positive, negative, and neutral words. So what they found actually is that this deficit was almost entirely with the good stuff that people might have experienced and didn't actually show up much on the negative things. The other thing they showed, which was very consistent, we know from lots of studies, is that positive, negative stuff, even if you sleep, are remembered better than neutral things. So we can learn two things from this. One, sleep is useful, right? We knew that. But it also means that important stuff is remembered well. And if you don't sleep, you might remember important positive stuff less than important negative stuff, right? There's some controversy about this, but it's kind of a cute result. Okay, so we can start to fill out this list. Sleep deprivation impairs memory. Again, no shock, I hope, to anyone in this room. And memory for important experiences are typically stronger, right? This is actually really useful because we all have lots of experiences every day that aren't important, and it's good that they're not filling up our brains. All right. Sleep also seems to have a role in helping us kind of figure stuff out. So there's a lovely series of studies on sleep and inference. So this is one example of one. Here's what they did. They gave people two stimuli, and all the people saw were these visual scenes. The A's and B's are for our reference, or visual texture. So they would see these two, and they were told, pick one of them, I'll tell you which one is right. And in this case, A is always right when it's presented with B, but B is correct when it's presented with C, so B is better than C. And similarly, C is better than D, D is better than E, and E is better than F. So this is what's called a transitive inference situation, because what you have is an implicit hierarchical relationship that looks like this, right? Because B is better than C, which is better than D. But they only learn this implicitly because they're only given access to these things one pair at a time, and they're never tested on the actual sort of more distant relationships. So then what they did is ask, well, what did people kind of figure this out, either these 1 degree or second degree of separation pairs? And specifically, this was sort of the experiment they did. So they had them learn these pairs, then they tested them on them, and then they either waited 20 minutes, 12 hours, or 24 hours during which the people slept. And then they tested both the premise pairs and the inference pairs. And just for people's reference, in the inference pair testing, what they do is say, just guess which one is right or wrong. I'm not going to tell you, but give it a guess, and so that you could sort of record those responses without giving the people updated information about what was going on. And this is what they saw. So first of all, they learned things pretty well, and they remembered them across the 12 hour and 24-hour times. These are the premise pairs. And then something kind of fun happened. 20 minutes afterwards, they had no clue about the inference pairs, the ones that were separated, right? The ones they'd never seen. But 12 and 24 hours later, something in their brain had changed such that it extracted some sort of relationship that they didn't know, that they'd never seen, that suggested that they understood stuff that they didn't understand before. And this is a kind of nice thing, right? This is a really good impetus for people to get some sleep because it gives you this idea that you might actually be figuring something out. Now, this doesn't happen in all sorts of tasks, so don't think that this is going to solve all your problems, but it's a nice reason that you can think of, okay, I really should get some sleep, maybe I'll learn something. All right, so sleep can extract some relationships. It doesn't, again, do this in all cases. And then there's one other thing I wanted to talk about, which is what I've talked about so far for these things are like memory of visual scenes or memory for words, but there's also for memories for how to do things. And for people who have trained in neuroscience, there's this big wall that's drawn in our introductory neuroscience classes between learning about facts and events and learning how to do stuff. And that wall suggests that some set of brain structures are necessary for one, but a different set might be necessary for the other. I'll come back to that at the end. But the idea is that maybe motor learning may or may not engage a different set of processes, and it may have different outputs. So in this particular task, this is one that's been used by many, many people. You have a person, and they have a little keyboard, and their job is to learn to tap with their fingers 4, 1, 3, 2, 4 as fast as they can, right? And so in these studies, they then ask, how does performance change as a function of getting sleep or not? And it turns out that if you train them in the morning and then test them, and you measure sort of improvement relative to baseline, they're okay. If you test them at the end of the day, they're okay, but not much better. But you do, in some cases, see a significant improvement the next morning. And you can do the same thing where you train in the morning, train at night, and then test in the morning, and they seem to get better. So this would be really nice if this were consistently true, right? If you could just practice something, sleep, and then suddenly you get better. This turns out also to be a little bit controversial. Some people say this happens consistently in motor tasks. Some people say that no, motor tasks, sleep just preserves stuff. But clearly something is going on in some cases where the brain is processing things during sleep and maybe in some cases making them better. So sleep also supports the storage of motor memories, and it may improve performance in some cases. Again, there's some controversy on this. But sadly for all of us, memories for things like facts and events only get worse. So when you hear that sleep improves memory, it doesn't. It makes it worse less quickly. All right? Now that's a good thing, right? Getting worse less quickly is actually like staying alive, right? That's dying more slowly. So this is a really good thing. And we should all be in favor of this, but it's like, that's what we need to think about is what's the rate of decay of these things, not is everything getting better. Okay, so we have this set of facts, and we'd sort of like to know what in the brain is going on that makes any of this happen. And so what I want to take you through are sort of the models that have been developed for this and things we've learned about that along the way. So for an initial model, we can start with some of the many, many brain structures that are involved. So let's start with the stuff that you actually use for seeing stuff and doing stuff in the world, sensory inputs, motor outputs, right? These are your ability to touch and hear and smell and move around. And we know that those are intimately coupled in these feedback loops between sensory and motor circuits, these more peripheral circuits in the brain. And those are in turn coupled with many more central circuits. This is just a tiny list of them. And those are in turn coupled with a structure called the hippocampus that Kelsey mentioned. Now, I put the hippocampus over there for a couple reasons. One is because it's a structure that my lab studies, so therefore it always goes at the top of any hierarchy. But the other is that it turns out to be really important for learning things and for doing things with them during sleep. So the hippocampus is critical for storing memories for the events of daily life. All right, so the learning process seems to be, at least in large part, some processing of information through this loop and changes in the connections between neurons, the synapses within the hippocampus and likely in many other regions while we're awake. So the hippocampus is really good at this. It changes very quickly to encode these memories. I'll just say for all of you, right, my goal as a speaker is to encode memories in you. And if you are here but remember nothing, then I have failed utterly in what I'm trying to do, which would be a shame. And that's all happening in part thanks to your hippocampus. If you didn't have a hippocampus, you could come here, you could pay attention, you could process the information, but you'd have no memory of it afterwards. It turns out, though, that the hippocampus seems to have a time-limited role in at least some kinds of memories. Now, this is, again, still a bit controversial, but some things like facts that you learn, if you take the hippocampus out of a person later in life, they still remember those facts, and they can still remember things about their childhood home and so on. And so the idea is that something happens to move stuff out of the hippocampus into the rest of the brain. Okay, so now we need to understand how might that work, but we also need to understand, why do we ever forget? Right? So if you imagine that you're learning things now, that means we're changing the connections between neurons in your head in some way or changing the routing of information. Why doesn't that just stay the way it is so for the next time you need it, right? Wouldn't that be better? Right? Wouldn't it be nicer to remember everything? And there actually are a few people who seem to remember everything, but most of us, fortunately, do not have that problem. And it turns out that throughout this process, after we learn during a day, which is thought to involve mostly strengthening of synapses, there's thought to be another process where we just downscale. That is, we return things back to where they were. So this is the theory of Guglielmo Tononi and Chiara Chiarelli, and there's a fair amount of evidence that one thing that sleep does is renormalize all the connections between neurons in the brain. They call it the synaptic homeostasis hypothesis. And the idea here is that if you take a neural network, a bunch of neurons, and all you do is strengthen the connections between them, what you get out is epilepsy, all right? Because everything just talks to everything and it starts reverberating. And so if you want to be able to learn new stuff the next day, you might need to reset things at night, all right? And that's the argument. And again, there's a fair amount of evidence consistent with this, but we still don't know exactly which synapses this is happening on or where it's happening or exactly how it's happening. We're pretty sure something like this is happening somewhere, but a lot of the details are still unclear. So I'm going to move that big annoying yellow arrow over to the side so you can think, okay, this is probably what's happening during sleep. The system is being turned down, reset so that it can be ready for the next day. But this is a problem because, as we said, maybe you don't want to forget everything, right? There's important stuff like, you know, which number is my hotel room? If I forget that, it gets very embarrassing, especially if I forget it multiple times. So I want to remember some stuff from one day to the next. And so I'd like to take some of that stuff that I've learned and, you know, put it into more permanent stores. And that's the process that people often call consolidation. This is often associated with sleep. We'll talk about whether it's only going on during sleep. And then the thought is here that something happens in this complicated network of connections that maybe stabilizes synapses or maybe even strengthens them. We don't actually really know. So that things that are otherwise getting trickled down actually either stay strong or get strengthened. We don't know which of those it is. But something seems to happen, so some memories get preserved, which suggests that some synapses are getting preserved. Again, the details still have to be worked out. Okay, so let me get rid of that. All right, so this is a sort of a starting point. And then we can ask this question, okay, what would actually be happening in the circuit when these sorts of consolidation events would occur, right? So to go to that, and how to understand this, I want to sort of take the time today to go through three basic questions. First of all, if the hippocampus is really important for this teaching the rest of the brain thing that I talked about, how and when might that occur? Second, how is information flowing during that process? So, for example, who's deciding which memories are important and which things get remembered and which things don't? And then finally, what does this have to do with learning how to do stuff? Which kind of, on some level, seems very different than learning facts and events, right? If you think about riding a bicycle, while you're doing it, you tend to fall over. Whereas if you think about, gosh, how does this thing, what's the color of an inside of a watermelon? That's a thing that you can just remember in an active process. And so is motor learning really the same? And I said, as I mentioned, this is traditionally had been thought to be independent of the hippocampus. Okay, so what could teaching look like? So for us to understand what teaching looks like, we first have to know, well, what does the hippocampus do? So this is sort of the bread and butter of my lab. We record from the hippocampus. We record from it in rats that are wandering around making spatial decisions in their world, sort of related to what Kelsey said. And this is an example of what you see when you record from a bunch of neurons in the head of a rat running around in the hippocampus. So on this side of the screen, you see our maze, which is this M-shaped maze. This is the animal. This is sort of a transparent overlay just so you can tell where the track is. And then here you're seeing what's called a raster plot of 47 individual units, we call them. We think these are single neurons, but we can't prove it, so we try to be careful. And each little tick is a spike from one of these neurons. It's basically a message to downstream neurons saying, hey, something like, I am here. Okay, now it turns out that in the hippocampus, individual neurons are active in places as the animal goes about its life. So individual neurons are active in little bursts, and you can see that in the nice color here, where every little neuron that's active has its own region of space. These are called place cells. Humans have them too. And the idea is that there's this constant sort of ongoing record of where the animal was, which could maybe serve as a scaffolding for a memory system associated with what happened at that place, or what's interesting about that place, or what do I remember about that place. All right, so this is what we see during an experience, and these patterns develop very quickly when an animal learning a new place. And so these patterns give us an idea of what kinds of things might we see if we're looking for the hippocampus to teach the rest of the brain? Because this is the kind of thing it might want to teach us, like, oh, all these places go together in my experience. So what does that look like? Well, here's a slightly more complicated example. This particular track from my student Jennifer has an extra arm on it, and she records more neurons. And so you'll see the patterns here get more and more complicated the bigger the track is, because individual neurons are active in multiple places. So it's really pretty when you look at it in a small, non-natural environment. And the more natural it is, the more complicated everything gets. But the thing I really want you to focus on here is this sort of light blue chunk. That's the output of an algorithm where we're taking the spiking activity and trying to ask kind of what is the animal's hippocampus thinking about? So what place in space is being represented? And so if you imagine that I wanted to identify a memory, all right, a memory is something that happens, like I can think about my home, but I'm not there right now. And to think about my home, I need to activate a pattern of activity in my brain related to things that I see in my home. How in the world would we know that it was there? Well, if we know what happens in my brain when I'm home, maybe we could look for patterns like that when I'm here, all right? And so that's kind of the logic here of what we're looking for. So what we can do is we can decode this activity, and that green dot is our estimate of the decoded activity. That is, where is the hippocampus thinking about, or what position in space is it representing? And so you see, as the animal wanders around, that green dot does a pretty good job of following. Sometimes it actually wanders off on its own. That's a whole other talk about how the animal might be exploring mental space. But you see, we can do a pretty good job of tracing out this experience using the population of active cells. So given that ability, we can now look at periods where the animal isn't moving. So here's one example. This is while the animal's awake in this track. It's right here, and you'll see this is a time in seconds. It's going to go by very slowly. So during this, every 100th of a second, you see the actual representation zoom down there and then stop and then reset. And that all happened in 200 milliseconds. All right, so this is what's called a replay event. So this is the hippocampus basically expressing a trajectory, a set of spikes that is consistent with the animal doing this whole thing. But this can happen 20 times real-time speed. And just to give you some context, of course, your own memories and things also happen much faster, right? If you think about what you did today, it doesn't take you 24 hours to think about that. You can do it very quickly. So some idea that these fast patterns might have something to do with memory is not completely unreasonable. So we see these when we're awake. We also see them when they're asleep. So this is a top-down view of that track, but the animal isn't in the track. It's actually in this little rest box next door, and this is kind of magnified up. So here's the animal's position, and here's the spiking we see. And so while the animal's snoozing in this rest box, we see that the representation hops over to this maze, moves over there. Again, this is about 200 milliseconds. And then at the end of the event, there it is. The animal has just mentally replayed in its brain this experience while it was sleeping, it was asleep. It seems to have replayed this thing that it just did, or it did, say, 10 minutes ago. Now, these sleep events can also be more interesting. So like this one, it starts in the maze, and then it goes down this arm, and then it hops back to where it was, and then it hops back again. All right, and one of the interesting things about sleep events in particular, which I'll mention again in a moment, is they're actually messier than the ones you see during awake. They tend to include more stuff, more random things as far as we can tell thrown in than the ones we see during waking. Okay, so this seems like a really nice mechanism for the hippocampus to tell the rest of the brain, hey, here's a bunch of stuff that goes together at a really high speed to squish it all in a way that would help the rest of the brain learn it. All right, and so then we can ask, well, is replay really have the characteristics we'd want to sort of fit all of those properties of memory we talked about earlier? Well, first of all, it does favor important experiences. So we showed many years ago that rewarded experiences are replayed a lot more. Novel experiences, we and many others have shown, are also replayed a lot more than familiar experiences. I will mention briefly that for the aficionados in the audience, all hippocampal people pretty much show videos of these beautiful sequential events. They actually make up the minority of things that the system is doing. Sometimes it just hops to a place and then stays there for a while. Sometimes it wiggles around and goes slowly. So we show you the pretty ones, but in reality, there's lots of other stuff going on associated with, for example, places, not just sequences. These events occur during what are called, or typically occur during what are called sharp wave ripples. The name doesn't matter, but I'll use the term SWR to refer to this event that we can detect in the brains of the animals, that is when replay occurs. And we know that these things can engage activity throughout the brain. So the idea here is if the hippocampus is actually teaching the rest of the brain, we really would like the rest of the brain to be listening, right? Because otherwise there's sort of no point, although we've all had teachers we haven't really listened to. Nonetheless, we don't want that to be happening in our brains when we're trying to learn something. So there's a really beautiful study from Nikos Logothetis' group where they did, in monkeys, they measured sharp wave ripples events in the hippocampus and did fMRI imaging so they could look at activity all over the brain. And they found changes in firing, basically activation of brain areas almost everywhere. In association with these hippocampal events. So this really looks like a brain-wide thing that's consistent with maybe teaching. We've seen these at the single level across multiple structures simultaneously, the frontal cortex, orbitofrontal, striatum, lots of other places this happens. And then this I mentioned before, it turns out the stuff that happens during waking is closer to reality than the stuff that happens during sleep. And so this raises the interesting possibility that the sleep stuff may be for something a little bit more than just remembering an exact thing. Maybe it's better for kind of figuring stuff out, for including more things that might be related and less things that actually happen. That is still a hypothesis that has not been demonstrated, but I think it's a really cool one, and I hope it turns out to be true. Okay, so if we come back to our questions then, how and when might the hippocampus teach the rest of the brain? The hypothesis that the field has, we certainly have, is these of replay events or reactivations of memories that engage the hippocampus. Which emphasize sort of the important experiences, is really critical to preserving those memories. And as I mentioned, sleep replay might include associated experiences. We're still trying to figure that out. Okay, so if we update our model now, we have this sort of replay process, and all I've really told you about is the hippocampal bit, and that engages the rest of the brain. And once upon a time, if you read reviews in our field about how this worked, it was basically the hippocampus acts as a teacher. And it sends these signals out to the rest of the brain, and the rest of the brain is listening intently and therefore learning from these signals that the hippocampus sends out. The problem is a bunch of work, including a lot from Yuri Buzaki's lab, who's here in the front, demonstrated that these things are happening at very specific times related to what's going on in the rest of the brain. So it turns out during sleep, the rest of the brain is waxing and waning in activity in all sorts of complicated ways. And these hippocampal events often occur after what are called down to up state transitions. That's when the cortex is quiet and then gets really active. So after the cortex gets really active, then sometimes the hippocampus sends out a replay event. And then that sort of asks us the question, well, who's leading the charge here, right? Who's running the show? Is this the cortex telling the hippocampus, hey, I want to remember this, help me? Or is it the hippocampus acting as a good teacher and just saying, this is what you should remember? So that was something we tried to figure out or to collect some data for. And this is really a question of how does information flow as these sorts of memories are created. Okay, so in particular, what we did was to look at the hippocampus and a very peripheral structure, the auditory cortex. And the reason we did this was twofold. One, we could identify events in the hippocampus, and no one had looked at auditory cortex in the context of these events. These are what look like sharp wave ripple events. But also, if the auditory cortex is engaged, because it's really kind of far away in the brain from the hippocampus, then we can imagine that lots of other areas might be engaged as well. And we didn't really know how far these events might spread in some sort of meaningful way. So the question was, do these things actually engage the auditory cortex? Are very simple, are more peripheral regions actually part of the memory replay process, or is this really more of a central thing? All right, and this is work of Gideon Rothschild, a former postdoc in my lab. So what Gideon did was to build a track like this, where the animal would be able to run to different places to get different rewards. And the animal had to learn by trial and error that 75% of the time it should shuttle between these two places for reward. But when a tone was played at the end here, it should approach the tone instead for an extra special reward. Gideon then moved the tone to the middle to make sure it wasn't just learning to approach the tone. Indeed, it wasn't. So the animal kind of learns this very simple thing that if I'm hearing a sound, that sound matters, and it tells me where I should go. All right? And so we're kind of interested in this question of, is that in somehow potentially engaging mechanisms in the brain that might have auditory stuff, what the animal hears, as part of the hippocampal sort of memory system? All right. So the animals learn this task. This is the inbound portion coming in. They get that pretty quickly. The outbound portion takes them longer, but they do eventually get it well above chance. And so we'd like to ask, during this learning process, what's going on during sleep? How is the system organized? What's happening with these two brain areas? So just for, again, aficionados, this is what the auditory stimulus was. It was a couple of upward going chirps. This is the spectrum. The details don't really matter, but the animal would hear this boop, 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 boop many times as it was running and get a reward at the end if it did the right thing. Okay. So first question, does the auditory cortex care at all, right? You can imagine that memories might not involve sensory areas, because maybe those sensory areas, all they're supposed to do is process information when you're awake. And maybe they just don't do much when you're sleeping. So to ask that question, we did the following. If we start with neurons in the hippocampus, this is hippocampal area CA1, and we look at them across these sharp wave ripple events, where we tend to see memory replay, you can see that on average, if you take all of these little spikes, so each row here is a sharp wave ripple and each dash is a spike, and you add them up, the neurons become quite active right after the onset of these events. So these are 2 neurons. Now we've known about this for many, many years. This is just saying we're detecting something where the hippocampus cares. But it turned out auditory cortex neurons cared too. So what we have here are the same events for 2 auditory cortical neurons, and you see they're also ramping up. These gray lines indicate the 95% confidence bounds on their average activity, so what we'd expect around these events. And lo and behold, the auditory cortex seems to care. It seems to be part of this. So sensory stuff may be getting included in these, which is good from a memory perspective, because we'd like to remember, what things sound like. So maybe this is what makes that possible. And it turned out, actually, this was a surprise to me, that about 37% of auditory cortical cells were engaged by these events. So that's like a third of auditory cortex, which I kind of thought was only for hearing stuff, is also turned on in this memory, at these times of these memories. Okay, so the next question is, well, does it mean anything? So we wanted to ask the question, is what's going on in auditory cortex related in any way to the experience the animal had? And so what Gideon did was to measure something called reactivation strength, which is basically how much does what's going on in auditory cortex when the animal's sleeping look like what was going on when the animal was awake? All right, and so that's all this measure is, and you can see it waxes and wanes in all sorts of ways, and you can see that there are these sharp wave ripple events in the hippocampus, and you can't tell where there's an organization from this plot. But if we then look at the shuffled version in gray and the real data in black, we actually see that indeed around the time of our sharp wave ripples, there's a little peak in this reactivation, which suggests that the auditory cortex at the time of these events is doing something related to the animal's actual experience. So there's a pattern there that's similar to what we saw during waking. Now there's something else we noticed about this, which was actually a surprise to me, I will say, which was this seems to start before the onset of the event. Now, we use the onset here because the spiking comes after the onset of the event in the hippocampus. And lo and behold, if you look at these 2 single neurons, you'll notice that they also seem to ramp up before the onset of the event. And to make it more clear what that means, let's look at all of the hippocampal neurons we have. And all of those hippocampal neurons are firing with 1 perhaps exception up at the top or 2 after the onset of these big bursts of activity where memories get replayed. By contrast, if you look in auditory cortex, you actually see a complete coverage of the space that can start well before and end quite a ways after. And indeed, if we just measure the average firing rate of these things, we see that activity ramps up in the sensory area before it ramps up in the hippocampus. Right? So this is not obviously compatible with the idea that the hippocampus is the overarching teacher telling the rest of the brain what to do. This is maybe looks a little bit more like the auditory cortex might be priming the hippocampus. But of course the real question is it? Or is it just stuff happening together that's correlated but not related in some way? Okay. Oh, and I should say this is, again, consistent with a bunch of work from Uri's lab and others indicating cortical activity can occur before the hippocampal activity. Okay. So, does it matter what the auditory cortex is doing relative to the hippocampus? Are they coordinated in any way? So these are a few neurons that indicate they actually are coordinated to, for me, what was a surprising degree. So what we're looking at here is one neuron, and these are the times that it's active in a sharp wave ripple, and these are the times that it's not. And the way to think about this is some memories, some things that have been stored involve this neuron and other things don't. So sometimes it gets turned on and sometimes it doesn't. So that's sort of by definition, we've taken all the events. And what we're doing here is taking a cell in the auditory cortex a long time away, quite a number of synapses away, and plotting it relative to the same events. And lo and behold, if the CA1 cell is on, the auditory cell was on. And if the CA1 cell was off, the auditory cell was off, right? And so this kind of, I thought, shouldn't happen in the brain because they're too far apart, right? To have such a tight coordination between things that are far apart in the brain did not strike me at the time we did this as very likely, but it turns out to happen. Here's another auditory cortical cell that fires less when this particular CA1 cell is on and fires more when it's not. And of course, there were some cells that didn't care at all. So this led us to ask, okay, given that auditory cortex is firing early, and then there's hippocampus, and given that these content can be related, can we identify a direction of information flow? Okay, so what we did was to ask the question, if we look at auditory activity before the sharp wave ripple, which is happening between 0 and 200, can we predict anything about what CA1 is going to do? Which particular neurons in CA1 are active? So does the content of the memory that's being replayed depend, or is it related in any way to which specific set of spikes are happening in auditory cortex? And lo and behold, it does. So this is a measure of how much better we can predict knowing auditory cortical activity from just nothing, which is in gray, and between -400 and 200, -200 to 0, what's happening on auditory cortex before the hippocampal event tells us better than chance what's going to happen during the event later, and then they're pretty coordinated here. Now, on one hand, this was cool because, hey, these are far apart areas of the brain. They're talking to each other from the looks of it. They're very coordinated. On the other hand, these are small numbers. All right, 1.01 is 1% gain. So my explanation for that is this was old and we had only handfuls of neurons to work with. So it was amazing that we could see anything at all. And indeed, as we've gotten orders of magnitude more neurons, these numbers have gone up by an order of magnitude or so. So we're pretty sure this is real. This is sort of a lower bound. Okay, but is it the case that these areas are just coupled all the time, or is there some real directionality? So it turns out if you switch the order and you ask, can you look at CA1 before the event and predict auditory cortex during it? You cannot, right? So this suggests that the information flow, to the extent there is some, is one directional from the auditory, from cortical areas to the hippocampus. All right, last thing then we want to know is, well, what about afterwards? Or not last thing, but for this part, last thing. Well, it turns out if you look at auditory cortical activity during the event, and then you try and predict CA1 activity later, it's not significant, although there might be a little there. Honestly, it's not clear how much this means because CA1 is usually pretty quiet after these events, so it's not doing much, so it's not surprising we can't predict it. But if you ask, how can you use CA1 activity to tell what auditory cortex is doing later, the answer is yes. All right, so the suggestion is that there might be this cortical to hippocampal to cortical information flow, or it's at least consistent with that. Okay, and then finally for this, what about sounds, right? And should we all be playing Mozart to our children during sleep, right? This is sort of a classic thing that people seem to like to do as though it will help them develop their brains or build memories or something. Okay, so one thing I didn't highlight before is that Gideon actually played sounds to the animal during the first and the last sleep session. And the sounds he played, there were 4 of them. One was the target sound, and the other were these different down chirps or pure tones or broadband noise. And just by chance, because the animal was snoozing and there were sharp wave ripples happening, we got overlap between these tones and the sharp wave ripples, all right? So to know whether or not auditory cortex or auditory stimuli are really affecting which memories get replayed, we want to know, are we affecting auditory cortex during sleep, right? Are we doing something that we can interpret? And does the thing we do change what the hippocampus does? And lo and behold, the answer to both of those questions is yes. So this is an indication of that we can decode better than chance which sound we're playing, which means the auditory cortex is still listening during sleep, even though the animal's snoozing. And this is the prediction gain we get from knowing what sound we played and what's going on in auditory cortex for what's happening in the hippocampus. So that's us saying, if we play a sound, it changes to some degree what memory the hippocampus replays. Now, I will say, before you go and play things to yourself during sleep, this is a small effect. And the other thing that happens when you play sounds is the rate of these sharp wave ripple replay events goes down, because they tend to happen in sort of an offline state where sensory input actually suppresses them. So we had to get this just right so we didn't wake up the animal and so on. So this can be done, but I don't recommend doing it at home. Yeah?
Is the arena entirely silent during the other part of the experiment?
Oh, great question. There are no sounds. Do you mean while he's running or in the...
During the non...
It is not perfectly silent. We did not do this in a true anechoic chamber. We tried to make it as quiet as possible, but it's not perfectly silent. Yeah, so there may be other things going on that could be biasing it, could be preventing the animal from sleeping as deeply or so on. Absolutely. Okay. All right, so for the second part then, how does information flow during this process? We have evidence consistent with the idea that it's going from neocortex, and particularly sensory areas, to the hippocampus, to the cortex. So if we're going to update this model now we have this idea that perhaps there's this biasing activity, that maybe these areas that have learned something like, oh, hey, that sound was interesting. Maybe they're sending that information through the rest of the loop and instructing the hippocampus, I'm just an auditory area. I only know about sounds, but I think this was important. So why don't you reactivate a memory associated with this sound and then go activate the rest of the brain so that I can link that sound to the things that I did there, right? And that's the current hypothesis. So, whoops, sorry, that was not what I intended to do. So if we have this idea that you might have biasing activity where you have elements of experiences that are worth remembering, perhaps that's caused plasticity elsewhere in the brain, also in the hippocampus. And again, this is a hypothesis. This is my best guess. We don't know that this is true. But the idea is then that would help the hippocampus figure out what to replay, and then it would replay, reactivating those patterns, co-activating the brain regions for the memory. So the sights and the sounds and the smells and the other parts of the experience that are part of the memory, and thereby helping store the whole thing. Okay? So that's sort of how we're thinking about how this might work. Okay. All right, for the last part in the last 8 minutes, I think I can do this. So what about motor learning? And again, I just want to emphasize, in my own education, motor learning was different. Motor learning wasn't hippocampus. Motor learning was you practice, you practice, you practice, and you slowly use non-hippocampal circuits to learn stuff. And that was because people who didn't have hippocampi could still learn motor stuff. The question, though, is do they learn motor stuff as quickly? And that's actually really hard to tell because they've had some various experiences and things, and there's some data out there to suggest that maybe they don't. So I'm going to show you some results of a very recent study that we did in collaboration with my colleague Karanesh Ganguly that suggests that maybe the hippocampus is important here too. Okay, so again, the model in the field is sort of like, well, learning of this motor stuff is really maybe involves prefrontal cortex, which helps organize things, but it's kind of slow cortical plasticity, do it over and over again. And the question was, is there anything going on with the hippocampus that might help here? So in this study, as I said, this was published earlier this year, or maybe I didn't say, what Karanesh and his colleagues did was they used a task that they developed. So this is a skilled reaching task. They have an animal, a little rat in a box, and there's a little slit in front of it, and on the other side of that slit is a little plate with a food pellet. And the animals are hungry, and they have to reach carefully through the plate, grab the food pellet, and then bring it back to be able to eat it. And it turns out they're terrible at this, right? So they're very, very bad at reaching through because they've never done this before. It's a really hard motor skill for a little rat who's only lived in a cage. So each day they would get sleep so that we could sort of assess the state of the network, reach training, and then post-training sleep. And it takes them a number of days to figure out how to do this, okay? So but this, again, it's a motor task, right? It's kind of like riding a bicycle. So that's sort of the idea. Okay. So this is what sort of some version of the learning curves look like. This is changes in success rate. So this is a little odd, but this is how we chose to plot it. So early on, they get better pretty quick. So that means high changes in success rate. And it's very variable across animals, but on average, those changes stop so that by about day 6 and 7, they're not changing their success rate very much. They're getting better really slowly, and they're pretty good at it by that time, okay? So they grab the pellet, they eat it, they're content. They're still getting faster, though, I should say. So it's not like they're done learning at that point. They're still getting better. They're still, bringing it to their mouth now more quickly. But learning of the sort of basic task seems to stop around day 7. Okay. What Jae Kyung, who is the postdoc in Karnesh's lab, measured with help from Abhilasha, the postdoc in my lab, was activity across 3 brain regions: hippocampus, motor cortex, and prefrontal cortex, all right? And this was during sleep. So when you stick an electrode in the cortex during sleep, you get those things that I mentioned before, up states and down states. So this is what the raw recording looks like. And you can see there's kind of a slow component here. Like there's this big upward going thing here that comes back down. This is actually upward. This is annoying. The upward part indicates that it's a down state. Sorry about that. I can't help. It's just the direction that things go, because this is when neurons are silent. So that's what that little down arrow is. This is a silent period, and then when it comes back down, that's when the neurons are activated. That's the up state. And so the question was at the end, does this state where this is where, again, the brain is quiet and then it gets active, does that have anything to do with sort of motor learning and reorganization and sharp wave ripples? And I mentioned that sharp wave ripples, on average, can happen at the beginning here, but no one had really looked in the context of motor learning. And again, the hypothesis was, motor learning doesn't do this. So what Karnesh and Jae Kyung started with was prefrontal cortex, right? These are areas that are supposed to work together in consolidation, and they looked at the extent to which that these oscillations, these slow oscillations, are occurring at about the same time versus at different times. So this is an example of one that's coupled. That suggests the areas are working together and doing things all at the same time, so maybe communicating. The idea is that that helps with memory, and there's lots of evidence that these slow oscillations are actually important for the memory, versus other times where one area was doing it and the other wasn't. Okay, so going back to this is the animal's performance, and then we wanted to ask, well, okay, what's going on over time in this prefrontal motor cortical circuit? And then we'll ask the next question, once we know that, could the hippocampus be contributing? Okay, so this is what's happening in the prefrontal motor circuit. So this is how much those slow oscillations are coupled. So early on, they're not happening together very much. So these areas don't seem to be very organized together in this learning process. Over time, you can see it grows, and then it actually grows quite quickly. And by the time the animal has mastered the task, it looks like these areas are really coupled during sleep. Right? So the idea is that there's some consistent brain organization going on in this network between the prefrontal cortex and the motor cortex that's detectable with this kind of method that's at least happening at the same time as the learning. So that's the first bit. Now, could the hippocampus be contributing to this? So it turns out, and I apologize for the complexity here, if you look at how much hippocampal activity is coupled to slow oscillations in M1. That is, how much the hippocampus and the motor cortex are doing stuff together during sleep, and this is how much that changes from pre to post sleep. There's a big increase from pre to post sleep, like the system is reactivating memories and in conjunction with M1, and that continues, and it falls off right when prefrontal cortex and motor cortex get their act together. All right? So it looks like what might be happening here is that the hippocampus is engaged and it's doing stuff that might be encouraging learning outside the network. Now, it turns out we actually have some neural evidence that something like that is happening, but let me just sort of schematize that here. So the idea is that early during learning, there is actual replay, and it actually is coordinated with activity in these structures. The hypothesis is that that is actually helping those structures learn to talk to each other, that it's speeding up the process whereby these non-hippocampal structures actually communicate, because it's activating them at the same time, telling them, hey, you two belong together, right? I want you prefrontal and you motor folks to work together so you can actually solve this task. Then that would increase, again, this is a hypothesis, but the data are consistent with this when we look at the neurons, increase the coupling between these regions, such that at some point, prefrontal cortex basically says, okay, I got it. Right? Hippocampus, shut up. You're just bugging me with these loud noises during sleep. I'm going to take over from here. I don't need you anymore. And so in late learning, when there's a high success rate, these sharp wave ripples are still happening, but they become decoupled from the events in motor cortex. They're just doing their own thing, and they don't seem to engage the circuit much anymore. And there might even be a little bit of a decrease in this coupling, perhaps as stuff goes from motor cortex to other parts of the brain, like the basal ganglia. That part is a little unclear. Okay. So to finish up, with 1 minute remaining. Good, I got the timing right. So which mechanisms are engaged in motor learning? It really looks like there might be early engagement of hippocampal sharp wave ripples. That is, the hippocampus might be replaying memories of maybe the box the animal was in. And that memory of the box might be enough to engage motor cortex early on and help it organize its activity with other brain areas so that they could actually work together to do something useful. And the idea is that that could still happen without a hippocampus because over time, those areas are going to just be activated together over and over during practice. But maybe the hippocampus is actually facilitating that and making it go faster. And as I said, there's some evidence that I've seen that even in humans who have hippocampal damage or hippocampal dysfunction, they take a little longer to learn motor tasks than similar humans that don't. All right, so that's the idea. Okay. And then again, this sort of idea of these multiple stages where the hippocampus is important early and then other mechanisms take over later. And that actually might be going on in other kinds of memory too. For example, fact memory, where we learn things that become divorced from individual events. Okay, so to finish up, so this is sort of our current model, or maybe I'll just say my current model so I don't have to shove this on anyone else's brain. And it's something like this, right? We have stuff during sleep going on, and that sort of helps bias what memories get reactivated. This could happen from many areas, but that flows through the circuit in such a way that the hippocampus can help reactivate stuff and create coactivity among all the brain regions that are important for a given memory, right? So you have a sound, it might act as kind of a cue for the rest of the brain to say, oh yeah, that sound went with that place and that smell and that taste and that feeling, right? And that's what the memory is. Then over time, for example, as those coactivations occur, we would get increases in, for example, in the motor cortical case, between brain regions that are important for a specific memory. So prefrontal cortex and motor cortex might learn to work together. Or if it was auditory and visual, the hippocampus might teach them how to work together better. So that's the hypothesis. And that would be then stabilization of these connections, basically stabilization of knowledge in the brain of stuff that should go together that wasn't there ahead of time. Now, there is no direct evidence that this actually happens. We have lots of indirect evidence consistent with this story, and I think it might be right, but we don't actually know. All right, and so I think this is something that you should believe about 75%, because there's a lot of reason to think it could be right. But remember, that we're, again, still in the early days of figuring out a lot of this out. Okay, I'll end there. I just want to acknowledge the various folks in my lab who contributed to all of these things, and thank you for your attention.
All right, we have time for my motor skills.
It's all right. Get some
I didn't sleep. We have time for questions. Just remember to push the mic on the side there. It'll turn green. Ruspe, yeah.
Great talk. I have two questions. The first one is that in patients who have hippocampal damage, can they acquire new procedural memory?
They can. They absolutely can learn it. The question is, does it happen as quickly? So it still takes lots and lots of practice in any case, right? Some of the data I've seen suggests that it might be slower, but the problem is the actual control there is really hard, right? Because everyone learns at a slightly different rate. But the hypothesis would be they can still do it because the learning itself is creating coactivity between, say, motor cortex and other places over and over again, enough to drive the slow plasticity. But the hippocampus might actually amplify that in a normal person.
So the second question, very quickly, in the experiment that you showed relationship between hippocampus and auditory cortex, are you correcting for autocorrelation?
Yeah, this is a great question. No. So just to explain what Uruzbe is asking. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the question is, in the experiment with hippocampus and auditory cortex, are we correcting for autocorrelations? And what that means is, if we know the state of the auditory cortex at one time, we know something about its state later because it has temporal correlations. It has some level of consistency. So in this case, we did not correct for them. So it is completely possible that while auditory cortex seems to talk to hippocampus, that hippocampus has no subsequent effect on auditory cortex. The reason we think that's unlikely is there's lots of other evidence that hippocampus affects other brain areas afterwards. But from that particular study, we don't know that auditory cortex. It's just so it's consistent with this loop, but we don't know that for sure from that study. Great point.
Tony?
They're not succeeding getting a microphone. Just holler. So you made much early on about saying that the hippocampus wasn't teaching the cortex, and that was old think. But as I understand it, new think is that hippocampus teaches the cortex by synchronizing things.
Yes, I'm sorry. I did not mean to say it wasn't teaching. I meant it wasn't it wasn't telling it wasn't the one necessarily originating what should be taught.
Right. So is that the key for you? Is it that the cortex already knows what it is that it's supposed to learn. You're just saying what's important.
Yeah, or that that individual cortical areas, the hypothesis, we don't know for sure, right? But the hypothesis is that different parts of the cortex have gotten something important happened, but they don't have the full picture because they don't have all of the long-range connections set up to all of the other stuff that would actually make the memory. And so by sending that through the hippocampus and back out again, you have the potential to activate the rest of the circuit and start building those long-range cortical connections. But then the hippocampus in that view, it's not like what it decides to replay is what is learned. It is that the hippocampus is taking orders from the cortex and following them out to activate the rest of the memory. But it's a subtle distinction, I agree. It's still an important teacher. It's just more of a pattern completion teacher than it is a de novo teacher in that version.
Right here and then over there, yeah.
So back to motor learning. What's the theory about the role of prefrontal cortex?
Yeah.
And I guess this is a rodent.
Yeah, so-
right?
the question-
Which part of the frontal lobe?
Right, so this is medial prefrontal, sort of prelimbic cortex. The question is, what's the role of motor cortex? And XJ, I would rather say I should probably ask you this as sort of much more of a prefrontal expert than me, but I guess the story that I would tell is that prefrontal seems to be very important for sort of organizing what should I do where kind of stuff, particularly early in learning. So once things are really well learned, you can probably do them without any prefrontal input at all. But during the learning process, the thought is that prefrontal is important for just saying, okay, look, I'm here, what actions are appropriate to this location? So that it would be important for sort of organizing the selection of actions in different places, or what do I do in this context kind of thing. And so the hypothesis would be that the animal has to learn, look, when I see the slit and when I see the food pellet, this is when I reach and this is how I do it. And so it needs to coordinate that kind of contextual task representation with the specific reaching. And then once it's got that down, then it can automate that later and maybe move that off to other places.
All right, let's go in towards the back there, yeah, there, and then up in the front. Can you turn on the microphone, just hit the button in front of you?
And I'll try to repeat it if it doesn't come on.
So the question was that, based on how often you encounter an event, say sensory, does it, is it, when you're recalling it, is it stored, or is the hypothesis that it's stored more bypassing the hippocampus? And if I'm trying to recall something that happens rarely in my life, which is maybe say meeting you once or twice in my life, then it still uses hippocampus when I'm recalling it?
Yeah, the question was, if you have an experience, like a sensory experience that happens infrequently, or say you meet someone was the other example, and you meet them either once or you see them every day, and you ask what circuits would be necessary for retrieving that memory. Is that a fair statement? So it seems that if you it's a little bit unclear how involved the hippocampus is, even if you meet someone daily, because there's some suggestions that maybe some elements of that experience still require the hippocampus. But if you've met them daily for your whole life, then you will probably be able to take out the hippocampus and still remember them. But if it's a single time thing and you're trying to retrieve it within anywhere from, certainly weeks, months, possibly even years after you do have that one time thing, you still need the hippocampus to organize the activity. So event memories, this idea that event memories become fully consolidated and fully separate from the hippocampus is actually unclear. And there's sort of, some people in the field say that actually doesn't happen, that you always need the hippocampus to kind of coordinate all of the stuff around those sort of single event things. Is that all right? Okay.
Okay, the question here, and then over here, and then here.
I was mostly curious about your sketch of the motor learning part. So later in learning, MPFC would need to actively ignore certain sharp-wave ripples, but not most of the other ones, which come from the same groups of cells.
Yes.
What's your theory? How do you think it kind of tunes these out?
So just this question of, okay, sharp wave ripples in that story are happening even after the animal has learned things well, and yet they don't seem to be coordinated in the same way, at least with the slow oscillations. So how in the world does the brain do that? Right? And this is a very fundamental question, how do we pay attention to one thing at one time and not at another time? And so in the attention world, there are these ideas that you can facilitate particular pathways, right? So you could pay attention to my voice, but you could be just not paying attention to what you're seeing and things. And our brains are really good at paying attention to particular things and not others. So one hypothesis is that these kind of attentional mechanisms can actually operate in the sleep sense as well. I mean, it's not maybe not the same thing, but something conceptually similar, where there's perhaps routing of these events somehow, where it says, look, the prefrontal cortex may be initially, or maybe motor cortex is initially initiating patterns, and those get routed to the hippocampus. And at other times, they fade out before they get there. So the hippocampus is still doing stuff, it's just not at the right time for it to be associated with the motor cortical pattern. Short answer that we don't know. It would be really cool to understand, right, what makes these sort of dynamics possible, what makes it possible for circuits to engage and disengage. And we don't know how that works.
So two questions. If you have a person that has no hippocampus or severely damaged one, how would that affect, say, acquisition of a new language?
Yeah. So first question, how does not having a hippocampus affect acquisition of a new language? As far as we know, it's impossible, at least in an adult. There are some examples of children who had hippocampal damage and still became verbal, and the interpretation of that is a little bit unclear, but the child's brain is so much more plastic than the adult brain that the idea is that perhaps things got rewired in a way that they could still acquire language. But as far as we know in adults, it's completely impossible at that point.
The second one was, how does sleeplessness affect old memories, established memories?
Oh, great. Yeah. How does sleeplessness affect old memories? So the presumption is that it affects them much less. That, as you lose sleep, the things that sleep is most important for are probably the events of that day. And that maybe other things get reactivated occasionally during sleep. We don't actually know if this is the case because we haven't been able to measure it. But perhaps, something from a year ago, if it was important, somehow your brain wanders around and finds it every once in a while and reactivates it, but rarely. But those are already ingrained by sufficient days, multiple reactivations that they're there. The other thing I would say is old memories are also perhaps the ones we're more likely to retrieve. The ones that stick are the ones we might retrieve more often during the day, right? And so we know that when you retrieve an old memory, you can sort of set it up again for new storage yet again. And so this is something called reconsolidation, where it happens again. So that may be a way of reinforcing things on these sort of shorter timescales so the old ones really stick.
Is that working? Okay. So you're a beautiful, kind person, lots of smiles, and very nice to listen to. I often joke that I hear everyone snoring at night because the United States doesn't sleep well, despite billions and billions spent. They self-medicate with alcohol, narcotics, drugs in general, and particularly marijuana. How are we going to expand your model into the real practice and benefit in medicine, which includes what you need for data? Hormonal losses and changes. All right, you need neck size, you need weight, you need blood pressure, you need comorbidities, you need overall baseline learning. I made a list for you.
I can see that.
I think we can take the general
I'll just give
principle
you
we get.
the principle is that you have a lot of comorbidities
Absolutely.
that
Yeah,
are impact. It's a funny thing about the head; it's attached to the body. I just noticed that.
It really matters. Yeah, all of this stuff matters, right?
So we have to expand the model.
Yes. So I guess you're absolutely right that this is a tiny part of the picture that is of what is going on, right? And all of this other stuff, if we're talking from a public health perspective, so many other things are relevant. So I guess the way I tend to think of this is, okay, first of all, just as if people understand what's actually going on during sleep, there is a potential for reprioritization. I think that's a low potential given the troubles in people's lives, but as a scientist, I always hope that knowledge will actually make a difference in people's choices. It's rare, but every once in a while it does. I guess the other thing then I would say is that, I guess I would encourage you, for example, to look at Yang Dan's talk. So her talk, she's really been focusing on the circuitry that controls sleep. And so that was recorded in March or May, I don't remember what it was. And she's identified specific neurons that actually help control sleep. So from a pharmaceutical perspective, there's actually a potential by taking the discoveries she's made and others in her field of helping with drugs that actually do a better job of encouraging sort of the right sorts of things. But beyond that, if you're asking me, how would we solve the problem that people are unwell and therefore medicating themselves, I personally am not able to solve that problem.
Which is to come up with a sleep bed that monitors behavior,
Absolutely.
takes in massive neuropsychiatric medical comorbidities on a baseline, and consolidate a new form of primary care that meets the needs of the American public. So
That
that's
certainly seems
what I
like a
have
great
in
idea
mind.
to me. I'm all in favor.
Let's take, there's one question in the back, and then we'll stop and thank Loren, so.
I can hear you well enough, and I'll repeat the question.
So I'm wondering about that in the twilight zone between wake and sleep, where I know for myself, that's where I do my best thinking. You're suspended, your mind's awake, but your body's asleep, and you're just kind of floating there in space. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So this discovery of the structure of the benzene molecule, which is this ring of carbons, the story about that is Kekulé, who did this, was staring into a fire, kind of zoning out, and suddenly he saw a sort of dragon eating its tail, or Ouroboros eating its tail, and then the structure came to him. I don't know how true that story is, but it's a great story, right? Either way, however true it turns out to be. And so, you know, a little bit like what I sort of hinted at in the sleep replay, this idea that if you take the structure out of your brain and you allow it to kind of explore a wider neural space, so you allow things that are weakly associated to kind of come up together because you've maybe turned inhibition down, you've let the system just free flow, that has the potential to create new patterns and new insights and new thinking. So that's what I would sort of say, I would guess is going on at those times, is, you know, a change in kind of the threshold for how much can come together when, allowing novelty and creativity in a stronger way.
Okay, one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, if you have, for example, very interrupted sleep, right? You sleep, you wake up, you sleep, wake up. And as we all age, interrupted sleep becomes more and more of a factor of life, right? You just, you don't tend to sleep as well. People tend to wake up more and so on and so forth. Yeah, it's sleep apnea, right, where you're sort of not getting enough oxygen. So it seems to be the case when that happens, you tend not to descend into deeper stages of sleep. So that's not something I talked about at all. But the sort of up and down states that I talked about tend to happen in sort of somewhat deeper stages of non-REM sleep. Which means your eyes aren't moving back and forth. That's the REM sleep bit. And so you don't get into those stages as much. So you would not remember as well. And in fact, there is one study where they looked at sort of the slow waves in people, and they correlated how much of that activity there was in the front of the brain and how well it propagated to the rest of the brain with how well they remembered overnight. And if they had less of those sort of deep slow wave sleep, they tended to remember less well, so they forgot more overnight. So the hypothesis would be, as you break it up, you start interfering with the memories more or not, you know, keeping them up with the downscaling, and they go away.